Hi, I'm Mimi Chan. Welcome to Culture Chat. Thanks for joining the conversation. Katherine Spiers is a food history expert and former journalist. She is also the host of top-rated food history podcast Smart Mouth, which explores the fascinating history behind all of our favorite foods and ingredients. We discuss how the pandemic has affected the way we eat and our relationship with food. Katherine also shares tips to ordering out and baking at home. As always, please continue to share this podcast with others. It would mean so much if you would also rate it and leave me feedback wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd like to help keep this podcast going, you can become a patron of the show by visiting my website or patreon.com. Thank you so much for the support. I appreciate it. For comments or suggestions, email me at mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or reach out on social media at SifuMimiChan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Katherine. So nice to meet you. Thanks for joining me on Culture Chat today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. Well, I'm a huge food enthusiast, which I guess who really isn't. So I'm happy to have you on and just excited to talk about food in general. So
yeah, I would say that I chose, in terms of my passion, I chose an easy topic. A lot of people want to talk about food for sure.
Well, it has certainly been a comfort, especially to a lot of people in this past year where it has been so tumultuous. And one of the things that I thought I would ask you right off the bat is I've noticed this rise in people who are baking for the first time and cooking for the first time and really sharing that with one another because we've all been at home. And I was curious how you, who have your pulse on all things food, have seen kind of those changes since quarantine. Has that been kind of really must be interesting for you?
Yeah, it definitely is. I love that people are cooking more. Of course, I love that people have time to cook more. That's like a big part of it too, is that in the before times and probably in the after times again, like people are just too busy to take on new hobbies in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. But I am hoping that people are learning that baking is maybe easier than they thought it would be. I think for a lot of people too, they hear that cooking is an art and baking is a science and they're afraid of baking. And it's kind of been my mission to be like, it's not that scientific. Especially if you're just doing like cookies or a quick bread or something like that, you can go free with it if you want to. Another thing I've kind of noticed along those lines is that I feel like Instagram has maybe gotten sort of more egalitarian, I want to say, because now everybody's posting pictures of their food. Mm-hmm. And it's not just, professional photographers or people, right, food bloggers who've been doing it for a long time. It's like, everyone's like, hey, I did this new thing. And it might not look totally professional, but everyone's like, hey, good job. Right. And I really like that.
Yeah, I think there is something really special about sharing in that. And there was, like you said, in the past, this kind of almost like food snobbery where if it didn't look like it came from a 5-star Michelin dining thing, you didn't want to post your cookie per se, right? Whereas now, and then because I'm a little bit old school, so I have this whole like, I still have this aversion to social media. So I'm like, okay, I don't need to share it everybody's 30 seconds of every day. Like, look, I just ate a bite of my sandwich. But at the same time, as a fitness professional, I find it super exciting that people are trying to cook in home because it is just a healthier method, even for a baked good, right? So even for a baked good, I'd love for you to dissect with me a little on that because I do love cooking and baking myself. Okay, let me rephrase that. I enjoy the product of the cooking and the baking. Sure. Everyone always thinks, oh, you must love cooking because I do it daily. Like we don't eat out generally. But as a fitness professional, it's been inspiring to see people taking their health a little bit more seriously and just like having that in-home experience because it's pretty much how I grew up. And so with the baking, I love that you attacked that first because really who doesn't like baked treats, and there is a definitive health difference in what you put into it at home versus when you go out and buy stuff. So I know you said it's not a science, but there is people who get really intimidated, right? Because it's the measuring and it has to be precise. But at the same time, I'm with you. I actually think it's really not so bad. So what advice would you give to our fearful bakers out there?
Well, okay. Here's a little trick. Once you have started baking, especially with cookies, always add a little bit more salt and a little bit more vanilla than the recipe calls for, because then you're going to get a product that tastes more like it was made by a pro, even if it's your first time doing it. But also just you I was going to say you can mess up, but honestly, again, with the cookies, I think cookies are such a great place to start because I don't think you are going to mess up. They're going to taste really good. If you dump a bunch of chocolate chips in something, like it's going to taste really good. You're going to do a good job. Um, but to your point, though, about homemade always being healthier, I have come to a point. This is so snobby of me, and I didn't do it on purpose, but I don't really like store-bought baked goods. Bakery, that's one thing, but like from a grocery store,
Right.
I don't so much like them because I can taste the sort of the added preservatives, the
Mhm.
chemicals that have been added for preservatives. So I do think that if you start baking more at home, you will get more of a, let's say, elevated palate. Whether you're going for it or not, it's kind of like a nice benefit.
Absolutely. There is something specific. Like I said, my background is in health and fitness. So the more ingredients that are on a package is generally, we just tell our clients, hey, this is a bad thing. Like if you just see like egg, pure sugar and flour, that's at least you know what you're getting. All these other
Yes.
terms that sounds like a science experiment, that's where it's science, is the people that are manufacturing it. It's scientific,
Yeah.
right? But if you just know what you're putting into it, you know where it comes from. And I think there's something with the whole baked with love thing too. Like you're putting in your feelings into something. And I think there's something special about that. That's why they call it like grandma's cookies, or, you think about that nostalgia, and there's a
Yes.
specific connection with emotion and food, which could be bad, but at the same time, there are some great benefits. And it's interesting you mentioned the extra salt, because when I watch cooking shows, which I love to see the pros, I always think, wow, they add a lot of salt to food.
Yes. Yes, they do. Well, see, that's the other thing too about why restaurant food tastes so good. It tastes so good because they add a ton of salt and a ton of butter. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how you get flavor. It's one way of getting flavor. But yeah, really important, if you want your food to taste like it came from a restaurant or a bakery, like cook it like they do in a restaurant or a bakery.
But maybe not every day.
Perhaps not. Yeah, I know it is hard. I think a lot of people maybe have gotten more elaborate with their cooking and baking at home because the other option is takeout, which for various reasons isn't sustainable to do every day
Mhm.
unless you're wildly wealthy, I suppose.
Exactly. And of course, I'm all about supporting local restaurants and businesses that are trying to stay open, and especially those small family-owned businesses and everything. But there is a different experience as well. So one, there's the safety of course, if you're not comfortable eating out, I completely respect that. It's not something that I do, but there's also, as soon as you get food, so not even talking baked goods are a little different, but like you get a hot meal and you put it in that container, and then the steam and everything, it's not the same as when it comes out from a restaurant on the plate and then it goes straight to the table, right? So from kitchen to table is very different from kitchen to box to home to table. Maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about why that is, and then how, are there any tricks to that, or is it just like eat on the way home in the car?
That is one trick. Yes, that's the number one tip. Yeah, I think actually being very specific about what you're ordering. For instance, I need to preface this by saying that I too want every restaurant to survive, and I obviously, because I'm a food writer, I'm a big supporter of restaurants. But having said that, maybe you don't want to order a lot of fried food if it's for take home. Because there's just some types of cooking methods that don't last very long, especially if they're in an enclosed container, like you were saying, and they just get steamed up. Like a French fry after it's been cooked and then it's been steamed for half an hour on the way home, that's not going to be as delicious. um, One thing that I think is really cool right now, and I'm from LA, so maybe this is especially happening in LA, but it's probably happening everywhere, is all these like pop-up takeout restaurants. People who have sort of been thinking, maybe I should start a pizza place. I've got this pizza oven and I'm pretty good at it. Let's see how this goes. I think this is a great time to be exploring new restaurants, kind of experimental places that might not be around for long, but get some kind of food. There's a Caribbean place in LA called Bridgetown Roti that is doing really well. It's getting so popular, and I'm not sure that it would have gotten as popular without the pandemic, because she does like just a limited amount of food every
Mhm.
weekend. The food is amazing, and LA doesn't have a lot of Caribbean food available in the northern part of the city. So this is just, you kind of have to search for it sometimes, but it's worth it. There's some cool
Mhm.
culinary stuff going on right now.
Yeah, yeah, and that's always a very exciting thing. So, I know that, let's talk a little bit about like, kind of like your background. I know you have a expertise in journalism, but tell me, did that always start off with the food journey, or did journalism lead you there? And how did you find your way to not your love of food, because I'm sure we all love food, but your expertise in food history?
Well, I pretty much since elementary school wanted to be like a lifestyle writer, like a food and travel writer. And how I envisioned it in the early 90s and until the early 2000s was sort of like a Carrie Bradshaw lifestyle.
Of course.
Like, yeah, of course. Like, that I could be a freelance feature journalist and I could live in New York. Of course, by the time I graduated from college in 2004, it was a totally different situation. But I did major in religious studies, and I was just fascinated in how religion influences history. And then you start to look at how food influences history, and you're like, oh, that maybe doesn't get as much respect in the academy or something, or it didn't at the time. But the way food and history intersect is always really interesting to me. So when I started writing, I was like a restaurant reviewer,
Mhm.
essentially. But I found that when I was writing, I'd always be like, yes, this dish tastes good. But do you know where it comes from? Here's an interesting thing. And like that for me was always the more interesting thing to write about, and of course read about too. So luckily, as I've become more interested in food history, I think the general population has too. Food became more of like a hobby in the US. And so, of course, the people who were really into it got deeper into it too. So,
Mhm.
luckily, I've been able to find an audience who also doesn't care less about the way things taste. That's not accurate, but I should say understands that everyone has different taste buds. So, just because I like something doesn't mean that the listener or the reader is going to like something. But if I find out where something's from, that's universal information that anyone could be interested in. So
Yeah.
I'm really glad that like other people besides me are interested in that too.
I think there's a great interest and need for understanding where our food comes from, and that kind of background, because I think as a traditional martial artist, there's this concept of always going deeper into something, versus just kind of staying on the surface, and that's fine if you want to just do things and try things and whatever, but to really understand it and appreciate it and have like kind of that knowledge, you have to like continuously kind of go deeper into the history and the foundation. And I mean, it's an interesting analogy, but for food, I think there is something very satisfying about when you eat something and your waiter tells you, well, this is from the when I was in Spain, they're like, well, this is coming from the valley over here, and this is the grape, and they're done by this specific vineyard of a family that's lived there for 100 years, and you're like, oh, and suddenly it tastes better, right? And so I know that part of that is the marketing of these restaurants, but it does make it interesting, because then there's a story behind the food, or how it's now known to be in this area. And I find that interesting. So it's just why I was obviously excited to talk to you. So is there something that resonates with you? Because I know you've been interviewing and talking to people from all walks of life and cultures. And is there a specific food that you've kind of learned about recently that's been really just like, wow, I had no idea, or something that really captivated you?
Well, every episode I learn something new when I'm doing my research for sure. The most recent one I recorded was about tabbouleh specifically, and sort of Lebanese food in general. And I didn't realize that what we now call Lebanon has been conquered by over 30 different groups over the course of history.
Mhm.
And once you learn that, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like everything about them is going to be truly international, especially their food. So you get to see where all these different food influences from all over the world, almost all over the world, influence the cuisine of what is now Lebanon. So again, when you're researching food, you can't help but learn more about the world.
Which is wonderful, I think, and
Yes.
how it's like everything intersects. And my husband, you know, he comes on this podcast a lot with me, and all my listeners are going to go, here she goes, this is her one thing she always says. And I truly believe like we'd have world peace if we just had like a world potluck and everyone just shared food in that experience. There's some special connectivity of like art and food and music and like that appreciation for things that we can all like agree on.
Yeah.
We all love to eat. So,
Yes.
so like,
And I think, yeah, I think lots of times people can get sort of defensive about where their food comes from there with quote marks. And I think the more you understand, yeah, exactly to your point, it's not an ownership thing. It's more of a over learning how much we all overlap type of thing.
exactly. I think that it's like when you meet someone, you're like, oh, you're also from LA. What part? Right. And then it's like, oh, you really like, you know, this type of veggie. And then you find out, well, wait, it's in your culture and my culture. So, my mom is, I'm Chinese, but my mom is Jamaican because she was born and raised there. And most of my food and culture is like very, very heavily Jamaican influenced. And so my husband is Dominican. And then we found like, wow, there's a lot of Caribbean crossover between the Jamaican and Dominican food. And like, you just like immediately there's more connectivity, right? Because you like, oh, you eat, you know, plantains and I do too. We cook them differently, but it's the same food, right? And so I feel like it's just such a nice commonality to have. But you're right, there are people that get very like possessive and defensive, like, no, this is our thing and you don't know how to
Yeah.
cook it. How dare you cook it differently or something?
Well, yes. But then I don't know if it's exactly the flip side, but I think it's also important to be respectful of people's cuisine and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this sounds like I'm an elementary school teacher or something, but a great way to like be respectful is to know about it. So I think having accuracy too is helpful too. Yes, anybody can cook any food, anybody can have any kind of restaurant, but like know where the food you're cooking from comes from. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah,
There's
that
nothing
falls
wrong with
into a
that.
little bit of appropriation stuff, right? Like it's okay
Exactly.
to take part in, but as long as it's honored and it's respected and, you know, credit is always given where it's due. And like you said, knowing your roots and where things come from, that absolutely resonates with me. So, I was talking earlier about that whole like world peace potluck. Like, what do you think is the one dish that would be the peacemaker of the world for you anyway?
Oh, wow. You know, my first answer, the first thing that popped into my head was rice, because people prepare rice so differently. But then I was like, wait, would that start a war?
Yeah, being Asian, I'll tell you right now.
Yeah.
No, that's not true. I like different forms of rice, but that's funny.
Well, I mean, you know, it's true because I think people, it's again with the defensiveness, people can be like, you see this on Twitter all the time, people fighting about this is the right way to make rice or something like that. But I think that maybe if East Asian people and Persian people came together, and in East Asia it was like, don't burn your rice, and then in Persia it was like, no, specifically scorch the bottom of the rice, that's where the good flavor is, and then you can sort of like exchange and be like, oh, both of these are good. I mean, I am neither Persian nor East Asian, so it's none of my business, but that's just one idea that I have.
And we do see that in what we call fusion restaurants, right? Especially amongst the Latino and the Latin and Asian. Because there's so many people don't realize there's so many Asians that have settled in a lot of the
Yes.
South American and Caribbean areas, and so there's a lot of well, generally speaking, there's a lot of Chinese and Asian influence in a lot of food because of how old the civilization is and all of the migrants. But I think the crossover stuff can be a lot of fun, but at the same time, sometimes there's like purities for me. Like for example, curry. I am very snobby about my Jamaican curry. Like I can hang with the Trinidadians, but like anything other than like the Caribbean style, like unfortunately, my palate just doesn't take to Indian curry or Thai curry. And people are like, what do you mean you don't like Thai curry? I'm like, it just doesn't taste right to me. Like it's expectation of what you imagine, I guess, when you see something. And so do you find that a lot with food as well? Like there's the mind basically controls how you feel about food.
Yeah. A thing that I absolutely have no patience for is this idea that some things in food are right and some things are wrong. I generally, of course, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, I'm like, no, everybody has their own palate. People just want to eat what they want to eat, and I don't think there's a value judgment around that. And I think, like, right now, for the past week or so, the big fight on Twitter around food has been about gumbo. And
Oh,
people
wow.
keep posting pictures of gumbo, and then people will make fun of them because their gumbo is too whatever. And maybe I'm too sensitive, but it always kind of hurts my heart a little bit. But it's also just a little bit like, so people will eat the gumbo how they eat the gumbo. Like, does it matter? Is this what we want to be mean about? Like, it's fine. Everyone's got their own taste buds. So yeah, I don't, ultimately when it comes down to it, I'm like, everyone just chill about how other people eat. It's going to be fine.
Yeah, ultimately it shouldn't bother you because it doesn't affect you how they
Yes.
enjoy their food. And I think if we haven't been able to learn and evolve from other people, cultures, time periods, then we wouldn't have the wonderful things we have today for food, right? Like, I don't know, you would probably have a really great example of something like that. Well, somebody who says, no, it has to be done the traditional way, but there's this certain dish or something now that if we hadn't had this influence, we wouldn't get what we have. Is there anything you can think of that kind of falls into that category? But I do know, like, like anything else, if we didn't have these influences or we didn't have people that moved into other areas, we wouldn't have these wonderful dishes and influences. And I think that's part of the celebration of food.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that the original form of ramen is actually from China. So there's a dish that moved pretty far away into a culture that doesn't necessarily always get along with China. And they've made this beautiful thing. Like, everyone loves ramen, just
That's
about.
True. Yes.
It's really great. But there's so many different forms that this question and this story can take. One thing that I always think about is green bean casserole.
Okay.
Which I think for a lot of people is a very traditional Thanksgiving dish. But green bean casserole was in fact invented by a woman who worked for the Campbell's Corporation, Campbell's Soup. She was tasked with finding out ways to sell more cream of mushroom soup. So she came up with green bean casserole, instant classic. Everyone who grew up with it, having it for Thanksgiving, loves it. But, it was made in the mid 1900s in a factory. There's no reason why that can't become someone's tradition. I do think it's interesting to know that it's not a traditional Southern dish, which a lot of people think it is. Like, they think it comes from like the early 1800s. No, it's not. It could not be more American in the corporate sense. But I think it's just, to me, that's almost more interesting because we can be like, oh, look at how marketing tricked us into thinking it was something else. That to me is an interesting story about food.
Absolutely. And that can work, I guess, positively and negatively, like anything else. But I take it that you are also a chef and that you cook for yourself. Like, what have you always cooked when you were young? Like you said, you always knew you had this love for wanting to do the, travel and food writing. But when you were young, were you like in the kitchen assisting? Has it always been part of your dynamic?
Yes, I've always been very interested in food. When I was a kid, I would try and make like elaborate meals, and I'm sure my mom did more of the cooking than I actually did, but I thought I was cooking them. I have some friends who are just such amazing home cooks, though, that I always forget that like I am a decent home cook. Yeah, I always compare myself to the very best, though. So.
But that's how you can aspire to continuously improve.
True. Yes.
What's your go-to meal when you don't have a lot of time, but you're like, I want to eat at home and this is what's in my fridge type of thing? Is there any go-to meals that you can share?
Well, I think that it's very important to always have a bunch of Parmesan in your fridge. And that's just so that you can make like a cheesy pasta. I will just do like fettuccine. For some reason, I feel like I don't like spaghetti, but I like fettuccine and linguine. So I will have one of those two always in my kitchen. And then putting a bunch of Parmesan and a little bit of butter on it. And then opening up your spice cabinet and going nuts. Just really like trying new flavors. It's how I learned that like I like a little bit of caraway seeds sometimes on my pasta. I definitely like a ton of fennel if I'm not doing the caraway. I like it spicier than I thought it did. So I guess I was about to say have a well-stocked spice cabinet, but then you won't use all the spices and they kind of go bad. So I'm not sure where I fall on that ultimately. But yeah, just almost plain pasta with a bunch of spices is so quick and like tastes better than the amount of work that you put into it, if that makes sense.
Well, right, because ultimately it's boil noodles and
Yes.
then get stuff in a pot. I mean, I my go-to is always like fresh garlic and onion, and you saute that, and like everything just tastes better, right? And so, yeah, I
Yes.
agree. I think for listeners who are always asking about food, because from the nutrition side, from our clients, we always get these questions. It's like, just try things, and then you'll know what to keep in your cabinet, and you'll know what spices
Yes.
you like, and then you'll have them on hand, and then you have your go-tos. It's good to have the go-tos though.
Yeah.
It's
And if you
important.
have like a little windowsill that you can do like a little tiny basil plant or some sort of, so you have a little fresh herb on hand, that always makes your meals feel so much fancier.
Yeah, of course, just the little extras at the
Yeah.
end. And then you can take a picture and share that on Instagram, because
There you go.
it's been sprinkled with fresh basil from
Yes.
my plant or garden.
Yes.
It
It's a
even sounds
win-win.
fancy. I love it. I love it. And have you always, do you consider yourself an adventurous eater?
Yes, I suppose so. There are things that I know that I don't like. I've had some negative experiences with organ meats.
Okay.
So just based on experience, I'm like, oh, not too much, a little bit, but not too much. Also, just for whatever reason, my palate is so sensitive about heat, so spiciness. Unfortunately, like I'm not a huge Sichuan fan, even
Mhm.
though everyone loves that right now, but I'm like, I can't. I just can't. I feel really dumb about it, but like my tongue is like, no, absolutely not.
What's interesting about heat, but even pepper, it's depending on what culture you're looking at. It's the level of heat. Like someone can say this is hot, but then in another culture that's mild, and so it's
True.
very tricky. I went to a local food truck place last year, and they do this chicken, and they have the little pepper symbols, but when you get up there, each person that went up, and this truck line was like super long, they would still explain, okay, this is Thai hot, this is so and so hot. Like they still really wanted you to understand, because they didn't want you to have this negative experience of like, no, give
Right.
me the number 3 pepper. Whereas it's very deceiving, these peppers, because it's something that each culture has their own level. Like to me, Thai hot is different, but in Jamaica we use Scotch bonnet, and some people find that unbelievably hot, but I'm used to that. But the Thai hot is different for me, so I find that much spicier. So it's really, really weird.
See, yeah, exactly. To your point, that is so funny because Scotch bonnets scare me. They terrify me.
That's one of my go-to ingredients.
That's so funny. I love that.
um, I love talking about food, obviously, and I shared with you that I have this Chinese Jamaican background, and so food is a huge part of our culture. It's not just, okay, this is to sustain us to move on, to live and function. It is really symbolic of like the love for your family, how you cook for them, family life, sitting down. I know in Italian families it's big. It's like 4-hour meals because it's community time. What is kind of food and that relationship kind of, what does it mean for you?
I can think of like certain things that we did when I was growing up. Like dim sum, for instance,
Mhm.
was huge in my dad's family. So when I think about dim sum, gosh, we would even sometimes do dim sum on like Christmas Eve, on people's birthdays a lot, or sometimes not a special occasion at all. But the fact of it being at a dim sum restaurant made it special.
Mhm.
And I think too, what's important to note about that is that we were going to like really old Seattle restaurants, and I don't know if they were actually what food people would consider good. They were just what we liked as a family, like people who grew up my dad's generation, people who grew up in Seattle in the 1950s. It's what like their perception of dim sum was too. So I think it can bring back all these warm fuzzy memories, and the food is a huge part of it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the best of whatever it is
Mhm.
that you're
Mhm.
enjoying. You're just like for instance, humbao, which is what we call them in Seattle, and I don't think they call them that anywhere else in the US, but the baked buns with
Mhm.
barbecue pork inside of them. Uh, I don't even necessarily like those, but when I see them and when I hear the phrase humbao, I'm like transported back to Seattle in the
Ah,
80s,
okay.
which is
Okay.
cool, right? I
Yeah.
think that's neat.
Yeah, I think in most bakeries they'll call them like char siu baos, but I'm
Yeah.
guessing hung meaning red, so it's calling because a hung bao is actually a red. package or envelope. So at Chinese
So
New Year, we give those out, right? But
we actually called them HUM is how it's
HUM.
spelled, which I think might be, maybe it's a dialect of a lot of people who came from a certain region and went
Yeah,
to
definitely.
Seattle. Yeah. But I've asked Chinese speakers this before and they're always like, well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think they'd have to see the character, and I don't
Yes.
actually read the character, and the pronunciation thing is really tricky because there's only like a million dialects
I know.
of Chinese, and it's really
Yeah,
complicated.
totally.
But
It's impossible.
yeah, it's super impossible. So tell me a little bit more about your background and some of the traditions. Like I love hearing about this is called culture chats. I love hearing about the different cultures and what the blend and mix of how you grew up and how that influenced your food love as well.
Well, so my dad's parents were of Scottish and Irish descent, and I know it's an easy joke to say that that's not like the greatest food, but honestly, I don't think of the food in my dad's family as being that astonishing. My grandma, his mother, could not cook. So lovable for so many other reasons, but like definitely not a big cook. So that might actually explain why when I think about food with my dad's family, I'm thinking about restaurant food because it wasn't.
Hmm.
I feel like they all really appreciate food. In fact, some of my cousins own restaurants now, like good ones that are well regarded. But yeah, the food that was cooked was not necessarily good, except for that in Seattle, there's access to really fresh seafood. And one of my aunts had a cabin on this body of water, a canal called Hood Canal, and we would go out crabbing in the
Oh yeah.
mornings and then eat the crabs for lunch.
Hmm.
So like that is one thing that I am annoyingly snobby about is Dungeness crab, just because I'm used to having it
Fresh.
truly freshly caught.
Mhm.
Yeah. So if it's been in the store for an hour, I'm like, yuck, no, I don't like it.
Expired.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that's one area of snobbery. And then on my mom's side of the family, both of her parents have sort of interesting World War II stories. My grandma, her family had lived for two previous generations in Hawaii. She's not Hawaiian though. So her feelings about Hawaii, having been born there and literally watching Pearl Harbor be bombed, she cries all the time when she talks about Hawaii, but she's not Hawaiian. So I have a lot of my feelings about Hawaiian food. I'm like, is this mine? Like, is this for me? I'm not sure that this is mine. So I love it. And it's a great comfort to me. And it's among my favorite types of food, but I'm always like a little hesitant because I am such a haole. Like, I don't know if this is for me. And then my grandpa was a refugee from World War II, and they sort of dropped all the Jewish culture when
Hmm.
they came to the United States. My grandpa's story is that when they lived in Germany, he got beat up for being Jewish, and then they came to California and he got beat up for being German. So for him and his family, it was kind of like, what culture are we? And
Yeah.
what they decided on essentially was being as American as possible.
Hmm.
So I don't really know, besides the fact that I like German potato salad and pretzels, at this point in my life, I'm still like disconnected from like both my German and my Ashkenazi heritage.
Hmm.
So I will say that I am extremely Californian, but that doesn't really narrow it down either because people from every culture in the world have moved to California and we have access to
Exactly.
everything, which is the wonderful thing about living in California.
Yeah, yeah, the access to different types of foods in the bigger cities and New York, LA, and it's I think it's an advantage. I feel like am fortunate. I grew up in such a diverse dynamic, but also being in Florida, coming from Boston, like there's enough variety that you can feel. Whereas I've been to places that you're very limited, and I think that also, and I don't want to get political, but I feel like it leads to a lot of closed-mindedness as well. Like when you don't have that openness to trying new things or that exposure to different cultures, it, it's crippling. I think it's crippling because
Yes.
you're losing out on that education and then that type of experience. So I feel like there's something there, but
It's definitely a huge privilege to live in a big city or a diverse area and just get to, I mean, even if you don't care about the deeper issues, just like getting to try all the food is pretty great too.
yeah, you mentioned you're from Seattle originally, or
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm actually was born in San Francisco, but I grew up mostly in Seattle
Okay.
and then Santa Barbara for college and then Los Angeles. So I am
West Coast
entirely
girl.
West Coast. Yeah. Deeply West Coast.
Deeply West Coast, yeah. But there are all those places that you mentioned all have like kind of like that diversity where you can try different things. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about something you had brought up off air, which were how people are learning about food and recipes and sharing. And I know social media is really huge, but I shared earlier that I have this like a little bit of a love hate with the whole Instagram and everything, because really it's all about the ads, it's all about marketing, and there's these algorithms. And so you had mentioned that newsletters are becoming really popular amongst I don't know if foodies is the right term, but like chefs and people who want to share and educate and have that dynamic. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think it's fairly well known even outside of media that media is going through a tough time right now. And that it's often the sort of like culture lifestyle reporters who get fired first. And these newsletters, you know, I have a newsletter. It's smartmouth.substack.com. The Substack part of it is the company that I write through. They take a cut of the subscriptions, but they don't own the content or have anything to do with the content or anything. So it's not entirely independent. They provide the platform and they take some of your money. But I think that for a lot of people, it's just sort of an experiment to see like, okay, well, we already know that there are so few full-time jobs in lifestyle journalism. The freelance rates are abysmal. The freelance rates are like what they were in the 1960s. Like they went up in the 80s and then they came crashing back down. It's horrifying and very few people can make a living doing it. In fact, you'll find that a lot of freelance food writers like have family money or are married to someone who makes a lot more money than they do or something like that. It's just really hard to do independently. But these newsletters are a chance to see if you can make a living doing your writing on your own. It's scary because you don't have an editor. So if you say something stupid, it's entirely your fault. but it also gives you a lot more freedom. If you want to write in a certain way, like for me, writing just about the food history and never covering new restaurants essentially is cool for me. In my newsletter, I'm lucky enough to be able to pay other people to write for it, which means that I can have food stories from India and Nigeria, places that I've never been and don't know much about. And I can have these people in the country explaining their food culture to a largely American audience, which is very cool. And I think something we all benefit from. Absolutely. So there's a lot of other people doing newsletters too, and everyone kind of has their own way of approaching it. Some of them are very short. Some of them are extremely long. Like no newspaper would ever let them write 5,000 words. It's really cool. And I imagine that the end result will probably be some sort of collaboration at some point. We'll probably move back into being more of a newspaper, but it kind of expands and contracts media. And this is where we're at right now. I think it's interesting at the very least. I think it's unfortunate that traditional media can't afford to pay anyone anymore. But I do think it's interesting that people are trying to pivot.
Yeah, no, I think that any way that you can get good information is a positive thing. And I think that's the frustration with, I don't want to say viewers or listeners or just audience members, right? Like the frustration is there's tons of ways to get information, but we just don't know which one is the quote unquote right one or accurate one, or it's hard. Like you have to be your own journalist almost and do all this research to actually get one story and then make an analysis on, okay, I've heard this and this and this, where so it's really challenging. And I would imagine, like you said, I want to read more about things like travel and food because that's widely positive and there's so much negativity in regular mainstream media that I still get travel and leisure, subscription because I can fantasize about being, in the Alps or wherever I'm not right now. And I think it's like still learning about places and where I can be. And so I think a way for, one great journalist such as yourself to be able to share that experience and be able to kind of constantly give us the good information is a positive thing. So in terms of social media though, I mean, it's like, is there a love hate with that as well? Because on one hand, there's a huge platform for you to reach quote unquote millions of people, but on the other hand, it's almost impossible unless you're definitely paying them, and and then you have some sort of viral success. Like it's a very double-edged sword to me.
Yeah, I never know. I never know what to do with that. And one of the reasons it confuses me is because my podcast and newsletter audience is way bigger than my social media audience.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sometimes I'm like, well, should I stop doing social media? I don't think it's actually doing anything for me, and it takes a ton of time actually if you're trying to do
Yes.
it professionally, and it's exhausting, and I don't know how much I'm getting out of it. But then I still keep getting scared. I keep getting scared that if I don't do social media anymore, then what? No one will listen to my podcast. Again, that doesn't make sense because more people listen to my podcast than follow my Instagram. So I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm with you. I actually feel your pain here. And I used to analogize it because I have a martial arts organization, and we're all small business owned. We're like a family, and I try to tell them, well, you just want to be present, because it's like back in the 80s, if you weren't listed in the phone book, no one could find you. So it's like at least having your listing there and kind of having a presence is important. But at the same time, if we feed too much into it and get obsessed with, are we getting enough likes, are we getting enough views, and also just building that kind of the people who do follow, are they really your loyal followers that care about what you're doing? Then you're helping reinforce things and kind of staying not out of sight, out of mind, if that makes sense. So I think that I'm with you. Like my husband and I have been on the cusp of like, let's just delete everything because this is too
Right.
much of a headache and we hate it. And we already know the people who want our information. But then at the same time, it's like, well, it's how
It's just
people learn.
scary, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
scary.
exactly. I mean,
Really scary.
I think actually just last week I've landed on maybe if I commit to not spending more than 20 minutes a day
Oh, yeah.
on
Yeah.
social media and none on the weekends, then if I only have 20 minutes, then I will stick to it just being work related stuff, and I'll stop doom scrolling, which I
Oh,
definitely do.
yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I'm pretty good about that since I'm so adverse to it. The only thing that I really like to look at are sharks because I'm really afraid of them and I can't stop looking at them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I am obsessed with it. But yeah,
Interesting.
so that's the only thing I really look at. I don't even like look at family friends. Like I don't follow. It's like mostly a work thing. So I'm with you. I feel a great connection with this here. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about your podcast because as a fellow podcaster, I feel a strong sense of empathy and connection with the struggles of being a female podcaster, but also very niche. And but you've had some amazing guests on your show, and I know you shared earlier you learned so much. But tell us more about your podcast.
Yeah, so it's called Smart Mouth, and what I normally do is I have a guest for every episode, and ahead of time they'll tell me some of their favorite foods, and my job before we record is to sort of find the one of their favorite foods that has the most interesting history.
Ah,
So we'll get together and we'll talk about a certain food, and they are essentially doing the color commentary because they've got their own histories with the food, and I come with the facts and the figures.
nice.
And I like to think that people will learn a lot without realizing it, listening to the show, because it's very
Trick them
lighthearted.
into learning.
Exactly. And it has ended up being a great way to talk to people, especially when people are on, their promotional tours for a new TV show or a new book or whatever. They're asked the same questions all the time. But if you can ask them these different types of questions about the foods that they grew up eating, you get different stories from them, which as a very nosy person is something I appreciate about how I've structured my show. I guess. Yeah. And then sometimes we'll do other things, like we'll cover like the state of food journalism. Like I had the San Francisco Chronicle restaurant critic Solejo on the show. So, I wanted to, essentially I'm a very nosy person. So I was like, no, but like, tell me what really goes on.
Give me the real details behind
Exactly.
the scenes. Well, as somebody who did, food critic writing, I guess there's a little bit of a mystery behind that. Like, is it this whole like, oh, you guys get to just eat free wherever you go? And then is it, I don't know why it's popping into my head, but it's like, 90s movie, like in My Best Friend's Wedding, when Julia Roberts is like so revered and the whole staff's going crazy because she's about to take her first bite and they want to know how she's going to describe it. Like it looks glamorous, right? Or in
Yes.
one of my favorites is Chef. I love that movie, and how John Favreau just goes completely nuts, and like that food critic is so, his word is like is gold. Like he'll make you or break you. Like, is that all like really true in the industry, or I mean, what's the dynamic there?
Okay, so the My Best Friend's Wedding, God, I remember that scene too. Like, and that I think was when I was in high school, so it was well before I was a professional, but it's like emblazoned on my
Yes.
memory. But yes, so the idea is that she's a very respected food critic, right? And she's in the restaurant and the entire restaurant staff is flipping out. And when the waiter comes and puts the food down, he stays there and stares at her while she takes a bite, and she takes a bite and then like issues her proclamation about the food. So the truth of that situation is that the entire staff would be pretending to not know who she is. And that is the crucial difference between that movie and real life, because restaurants, high-end restaurants make it a point to know who all the restaurant critics are. They even have photos of them at the hostess stands taped up so that if someone comes in, even if they've used a fake name, which they do, the hostess will be like, uh-oh, red alert. We've got a critic in the house. So yeah, that scene was almost right, except for and she too would have been pretending that she didn't know that they all recognized her.
Right. Like, oh, I'm a mystery diner.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and this doesn't happen as much anymore, but there were so many restaurant critics who would full on have costumes and like go-to names that they would use, wigs, the whole deal. They really wanted to stay anonymous. Yeah. But again, the type of restaurants that traditionally got reviewed, they were in on it too. Like they knew who everyone was. It's a little different with like influencers.
Okay.
Those people have probably contacted the restaurant or the restaurant's publicity group ahead of time and announced themselves and said they were coming. So then the situation that influencers have is more true to Julia Roberts in My Best Friend's Wedding. Okay. It's different than food critics who work for a publication. However, for anyone who wants to know what it's really like being a food critic, for me, the movie Ratatouille,
oh yeah,
the restaurant critic is an antagonist and his name is Anton Ego, but at the end he has this huge revelation that I get teary even thinking about. Like for me, it really expressed why people do food criticism. So if anyone hasn't seen that movie, I recommend it, even not for that scene.
Okay. And as a food critic, because I always thought, oh, this is something I would love to do. Then I'm like, no, I'm too picky of an eater because I like have a mushroom allergy and then I have this and I don't eat that. And so is it something where you really have to kind of be open to eating everything, or can it be, well, I only do the gluten-free restaurants or vegan restaurants? Like, how does that work?
Right. Well, I think that just human nature, there's this thing that we do in our brains when if we don't like something, then it is bad. Like, I don't like olives, so it's easy for me to say olives are bad. But that's not true. I don't like olives only means I don't like olives. So if you're critiquing food professionally, you have to understand taste and flavor aside from your own preferences. And that's, I think, probably the most, like, I don't know, intellectually challenging part.
Right.
Yeah, to be like, no, just because I don't like this, but does that mean it is bad? And not necessarily. So you kind of have to really sit down and work that out for yourself. And then you have to actually write the review, which is also difficult.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and I know we're coming on our time here. I have a few other questions I wanted to ask you, not to stay on this, but like as you go to write a review, because even though you're not necessarily like a quote unquote food critic right this second, like you're still always judging's the wrong word, but
it's kind of the right word.
Commenting on food, right? And so is it painful when you have to be like, this is terrible, and it must be really hard to do, especially if everyone was nice and whatever, but
right. Yes, it is. It's awful and terrible, and it's something that I did when I was younger, but as I've grown older, I take Jonathan Gold was probably the most famous food critic ever, and he was in Los Angeles, and he just basically didn't write about a place if he didn't like it. And I actually think that's the way to go. You don't need to be out here hurting people's feelings, and I regret past times where I probably did do that. It's just, if you don't like it, we don't need to talk about it, which is boring but nicer.
I think we could all use a little extra kindness in the world right
Right?
now, though.
Yes.
It's like I'm with you. I think as it sounds like such what an old person would say, but as you get older, you realize that it's less important to point those things out and more important to highlight the positive and just like kind of move into that direction. So I'm with you there.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm with you there. So I did want to talk about two more areas. One is restaurants and the other is cooking shows. So as a food expert, I need to know, like, which shows are you loving? And like there's like a zillion different cooking shows and documentaries. And like I guess if you had to pick a couple to recommend, which ones would those be?
You know what's funny is there's a cooking show, I think it's on Cooking Channel, that Amy Schumer did with her husband. I'm not sure if they're still doing it.
Okay.
Very cute. Just nice. They're a nice couple, and they were making approachable food, and obviously she's funny, and he clearly is, I mean, not in like a henpecked way, but he's very like, yes, dear. It's okay. It's just like, I like them together. It was a show that I didn't expect to like, and I really did. And then of course, all the food shows on Netflix are very high quality, and I really like Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. I think that's the right order.
Yep.
That's just 4 episodes. Very enjoyable, very beautiful. But my all-time favorite is still Top Chef. I love Top Chef.
You love Top Chef? That's the classic.
Yes, exactly.
And the Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat is also a pretty good book as well.
Yes. Yeah. That is a great book for people who are visual learners, for one thing. The illustrations in it are really good. And it's also for sort of when you're just starting out with cooking. It's a great book. Yeah.
And speaking of books, are there other books that you recommend from not just even like a learn how to cook, but the food history part? I know that someone once recommended a book to me, and I have it in my show notes somewhere on another podcast, but I love getting recommendations from journalists about reading material.
Gosh, I think that I like almost all the books that are about the history of any particular food item, because, gosh, it does get specific, and I haven't read all of them, but there's a book about the history of peanut butter. That actually can go back quite a ways, but there's also a book about the history of Jell-O, which I think it's called The Jell-O Girls, and I've only read excerpts, but I just love that it exists. There's also a woman who writes for The New Yorker. Her name is Dana. Hold on, I'll find it. Dana Goodyear. So Dana Goodyear is a journalist, and she sort of kind of came into food writing sideways, and I love her books. I think that she does such interesting stuff, and her articles in The New Yorker. She's great. Not food history, but Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, I think, will always be a classic of the genre. And reading it now is weird. 20 years later, there's some stuff that he wrote then that he probably wouldn't write now, but I think it's a great book if you want to understand the restaurant industry.
Yeah, which is, oh my gosh, a whole nother dynamic.
Right? Yeah.
I've had some chefs on the show and some restaurateurs, and it's just like it's like the ballet or the theater. Like, you have no idea what's going on behind the curtain because everything looks so smooth out front.
Yes.
But in the back, like, things are flying. Like, you imagine like chickens flying by, but out front everything is like beautiful and coordinated and orchestrated. And I always find restaurants to be the same way, and I'm super fascinated. And so that was my kind of final kind of question is, like, in terms of restaurants, I mean, I know like you've been able to travel probably extensively. We didn't even get to talk about that. We'll have to talk again, but like, are there restaurants that really stick out in your memory? And it could just be the Seattle dim sum place or but that really resonate from high end to like hole in the wall, like maybe a couple of each.
Oh my gosh. So just off the top of my head, Bertillon is an ice cream place in Paris. It's spelled like Bertillon. And it is, maybe the ice cream isn't the best. I honestly don't remember, but you sit down. It's very much like an elegant ice cream parlor. So I love that part of things too, just the experience of being in places. The same way how in Paris, any cafe, if you just sit down in the morning with a coffee and a slice of baguette called tartine, which is what you get, you can just sit there all day and it's just wonderful. food-wise, like more specifically food-wise, I love Pizzeria Mozza in Los Angeles. One of the things that I find interesting is that it opened to great fanfare, and it was a celebrity favorite. But somehow it wasn't a flash in the pan. It's been like 9 or 10 years, and it's still really good.
Mhm.
So that's a place I can always recommend. I could deliver an entire lecture on restaurants in Los Angeles and the good ones, because there's just such a variety of food to be eaten there.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, this question sometimes even trips me up, because I'm like, where do I start and where do
I know. When you have such a love, it's hard. I think anything, that's why I never like to say what's your favorite, right? Because then you're just like, oh my gosh. But I love the ice cream one, because it just takes us to those memories. Like you said, there's meals I've had that have been unbelievably memorable, and it, like you said, it might not be because it was like the best piece of steak I ever had or the best whatever, but there's just something about that whole experience. But not that this was my favorite ice cream place, but literally my husband and I were in Italy, and we were in one of the small towns in the Tuscan area, and this place was like, oh, we won the best gelato of the world in whatever year, and it was like freezing and raining, and I'm like, we're gonna freaking try this ice cream. I don't care if I'm cold or whatever, because I'm like, how can you not, like, this is like the world, whatever. And I'm like, hopefully it's not like Elf, where it's like, hey, this is the best coffee in the world.
Right.
Like, hopefully, I mean, it was actually legit, but it was just funny because you want to have that experience, and you want to have it somewhere when you're traveling, and that I mean, I can't tell you if it was the best gelato in the world as well, but you just have these memories, and they're fun, and I think that's what food does. It just, there's so much nostalgia attached, and it's not always the palate.
Right. Yeah. And you learn so much too. There's a restaurant in Rome that unfortunately I always forget the name of, but I was eating there when I was like 19 or 20, and for dessert, they just give you fresh fruit. And I remember watching the man next to me just like cut open a peach, and that was his dessert. And, as an American, I was like, what? Like, just a peach at a restaurant? But if it's the best peach in the world, then heck yeah, that's dessert. So that was really educational too.
Yeah, I love that. And it's been such a trying time for those of us that love the travel and going to different exotic places and sharing in that food experience. And so how have you subsidized, I don't know if that's the right word, but how have you kind of replaced that? Because I'm guessing you're not flying all over the world and getting to try a bunch of food right now. I mean, how have you been able to kind of fill that void?
Gosh, I guess professionally, what I do, like, at least tides me over a little bit, but I can't lie. I was planning a trip to the Republic of Georgia before the pandemic, and I'm still a year later extremely upset that trip didn't happen.
I would be too.
Not necessarily graceful about it. I really want to go still, though. I'm really like just sitting here tapping my fingers on the desk being like, vaccine, vaccine, vaccine. Come on, let's do this.
Yes, I'm with you. I am with you. So, well, is there anything else you want to share with us about what you're doing? I will link all of the info here so they can follow you on your social media, but also listen to your podcast and your blog and all of these different, or is it called, sorry, it's not a blog, it's a newsletter.
I mean, they kind of mean the same thing. So yeah. No, just, the podcast and the newsletter are both called Smart Mouth. I'm nominally on social media under my name, and I think that's all I have to promote. Just me.
Well, here's to hopefully, like you said, vaccine, so we can all travel more, eat more, and appreciate food more. Katherine, thanks so much for being on the show today. It was really, really great to meet you and talk to you.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks so much for having me.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat, and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com, or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.